Welcome to the Ephesiology Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the study of the early Christian movement and its implications for the church today. We've arrived at our next installment in our Make Disciples podcast series, where we are covering what a disciple is, who we are in Christ, and what are the characteristics of a follower of our King. Today we are discussing the characteristic that disciples prepare. To sufficiently cover it, we have Michael, our resident ephesiologist. I'm Andrew Johnson, associate pastor at Neartown Church in Houston, Texas. And we went to that Australian well again and are joined by Bree Mills. Bree is an ordained Anglican minister and a doctoral student in the area of missional leadership. She's focusing on innovative leadership in the Australian context. She is presently ministering with her husband in the micro church area in Melbourne. They are there with their kids. They are having fun. They are doing life. Bree, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, mate. It's great to be chatting.
Okay, so Bree, as I try to make sure to ask all of our guests, I can describe bits and pieces of what you are doing, but I would love for you to share with us what are some important things that you would love for people to know about you and what you do.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm really passionate about is how we develop leaders. So that's my doctoral thesis, how we develop innovative leaders for the Australian context. But I'm particularly passionate about doing that with women and women in church planting. So that's been something that God's been really just stirring in me a lot recently. So that's a big part of what I'm doing in Australia. And it's also because so many of the micro church and simple church leaders that we're seeing come to the forefront, both in Australia and in New Zealand, are women. And so that's really, for me, that's really grown a fire for actually how do we develop and prepare these people for what God's calling them into.
Wow, that is cool. Well, we're grateful that you're joining us, Bree, and I think you're the perfect person I'm sure there are others that we might say that are perfect, but you're a perfect person to come and interact with us on this topic of what does it mean that disciples prepare? So we'd love to hear from you. You're into leadership development. You've been doing this for some time. You did your master's work in missional leadership and now your doctoral work. What comes to mind when you think about the preparation of disciples?
Yeah, oh my gosh, so many different things. I think for me, the biggest part for me is that it's got to be a holistic process. So often in our churches, we disconnect discipleship or leadership development from the rest of our lives, like there's a spiritual box that we can put it in. And especially when you're raising women and you're discipling women, there is less boundaries between our lives, especially if you're raising kids and doing other things like that. So really discipleship has to have that real holistic, all of life focus. And so for me, that's a really big part of just reframing and rethinking even the pedagogical approach to discipleship in this space is how does it embrace that holistic all of life, which I think in our churches today, certainly in Australia, we've kind of disconnected, and we have these courses and we'll run people through, discipleship 101, 201, 301. But it's so disconnected from the rest of their life, and it's not relational, and it's just not engaging the whole person. So often they fall flat, and you just see very, very little fruit coming out of those sort of processes. So for me, it's that real relational process. It's the life on life of actually walking alongside people, as well as the typical content and other things that need to be in there, but doing that in a really holistic way that embraces the whole person and I guess the whole process of formation, not just formation of what they're thinking or how they're acting, but how they're feeling and the spaces they're inhabiting, because I think that shapes them as well. So all of those sort of pieces are really, I think, key in that sort of formational space.
Okay, so as I'm processing what you are saying, Bree, it hits me that there might be others who are listening saying, well, yeah, I mean, we would love for people to have, that perfect blend of not just the head, but the heart and the life and that holistic discipleship.
And the emotion. I mean, that's something
Yes.
that we don't hear much about, to be honest. You know, when I think of preparing disciples, I think like a man.
Really?
You know,
Good.
Well,
I mean,
yeah, and I should listen to my wife more, but I'm thinking of identity, of that being how we behave, what we believe, you know, who we belong to, but rarely would I think of emotion as a part of that, and I love that.
Yeah, and I think if we're discipling the next generation, I don't know what it's like in the US. In Australia, our young adult culture is very much based on doing what they feel like doing. And so if somebody is only getting they're only reading their Bible when they feel like it, or they're only, following Jesus when it's, when they feel led to, like there's this whole emphasis in emotions in this next generation that actually sometimes we have to help people to understand that their emotions are not always in like godly emotions, and that they actually need to use other capacities to kind of check on those and then to process those.
So, so how, right? Like, how do you go about doing some of these things so that it doesn't feel like pie in the sky? It doesn't just seem idealistic. I may have been accused of being idealistic a time or 12 in my life. So how do you do these things where you're going to disciple on a holistic manner such that the logical and the emotional and the way that it bears out and how we live, how do you cover all of that?
Yeah, I think that it needs to be done in community. So this is like so often we take discipleship down to a one-on-one process. Jesus did it with 12 or 3, depending on which emphasis you want to go for. But I actually think you need to be in those sort of spaces of community, in part because you can get discipled by one person and they can be like you, and they can be someone who ticks all your boxes or aligns with you thought-wise. And so there's not a lot of rub. Whereas when you're in a group and there's 3 or 4 different people, there's going to be people different to you who make you react in different ways, which is actually going to help sharpen you and mold you more to be more like Jesus. Because if you're only being discipled in a context where it's comfortable and you know each other, and I guess you're similar like personalities, an apostle, thinking of the APEST kind of idea, the fivefold ministry, if an apostle's discipling an apostle, that's great, but actually an apostle needs to learn what it looks like to rub up against a pastor, because the apostle needs that pastoral edge, and the pastor needs that apostolic kind of movement as well. And so I actually think for me, we are big about doing it in group context in Australia. So whether that's within your micro church, we run some other small group kind of discipleship methods around what we call discipleship groups, but they're like group coaching around kind of 6 to 8 people who gather specifically for the purpose of discipling one another. Some of them are peer-led, depending on what age and stage they're at. Some of them are actually have a key leader who's got some key thoughts to run through. But those spaces are really important. And even within those spaces, to be able to have these sort of conversations is developing that deep trust and psychological safety and all those sort of things that you need to be able to have real and open and honest conversations about what's driving you and how you're going in that sort of discipleship journey.
Well, the community aspect, of course, is something that we're always talking about in terms of doing theology and community, but thinking in terms of doing discipleship and community is a wonderful thing. What do you do? I mean, this just struck me because I was in a conversation not too long ago with someone who's doing discipleship and community. And they were sharing about one person in the group being so dominant in the group. How do you navigate those kinds of things, Bree?
Yeah, with good leadership,
right?
good group dynamics and good leadership. I think some of the methodologies that we tend to use ensure that people aren't dominant. So one of the things that we do is we start by actually getting everyone to go around the circle and say, "What's God been saying to you since we last met?" And so everyone gives a little bit of a headline of where they're at or what God's been speaking into their lives. And to a degree, it means that no one can then hijack the room for 30 minutes. It's literally supposed to be 1 or 2 sentences. But then we hear from everyone, and often you'll see there's a theme going on between different people. And so then we'll press into that particular theme, start to talk about it, look at scripture, look at other things that can inform the particular challenge or discipleship issue that's going on in that sort of space. So I guess some of the ways you set things up can make sure that everybody has a voice, but a lot of it has to do with actually how do you lead in that space?
Mm-hmm.
When you come into those spaces as a leader, again, like you're saying, how do you do it? Well, you have to lead well. Make sure it's not your first rodeo.
Says the guy from Houston, Texas.
Hey, I own the gear, that I can confidently say, and I grew up next to cornfields. But I'm a city boy. The question that I was trying to get to, Michael, Bree, how prepared, right? Like, do you have like a list in the back of your mind? Like, okay, if this thing comes up, I know I can go to these passages of scripture. If this sort of thing comes up, I know I should go here. Is there like a library of things that you are resourced with and that you are resourcing future leaders? Is this more born out of, I've done this a time or two and this is what I've learned? Like, how do you gauge that?
Yeah, both, basically. Okay. So we actually built something we called the DNA of discipleship for our network of micro churches years ago when we started. And it was really, these are the key ideas that we think every disciple in our context needs to know. So specific to our context, where we're leading people, what we think the key issues that they're going to come up against are, just some of the basic principles of discipleship. But we literally have like a DNA of discipleship, which is like we used to call it our toolkit. And so that's in the back of our minds. That's certainly what in terms of content-wise, that's what we teach through in these spaces. But we'd do a bit of content one week, and then the next couple of weeks, there wouldn't be any content. We'd actually just be working that through in people's lives. It's like, how'd you go practicing that? Come back, tell us the stories. Where are you struggling? Let's work through that. So it's not knowledge-based discipleship. It's obedience-based discipleship. So it's really seeking to move from what do you know about Jesus to actually how are you living it out in that space. And so the content's really just a prompt or hey, here's a key tool, here's a key principle, a key theological idea. Now let's actually embed that in your life and work through that. And we try not to push to the next key idea until we actually started to see people picking it up and embedding it into their life, whether we see that through our discipleship group or through their micro churches or missional communities they're a part of, actually seeing them to actually take hold of it and understand it and really live it out.
It sounds like inherent in that is what you just said, living it out. That it's not just something that they're taking in, but they're living it out in their communities. And it sounds like that is even, or at least the encouragement is to go beyond your community, to live that out in your neighborhoods and schools, grocery stores, wherever you are.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So most of the leaders who are in these discipleship groups are leading some expressions of church in their local community, which usually has quite a clear missional purpose or direction. And so it is actually about taking it from that discipleship context and embedding it in their mission and in their discipleship for other people, whatever that looks like in their context. So yeah, and the nice thing is we tend to have more than one person from each microchurch in their discipleship group. So they go out from that space into their mission context with a couple of them together who can keep each other accountable, who can help one another. So it's not that sense of, okay, now you go on your own and do this, but you actually get to go with someone else and really keep practicing this in the day-to-day, in the life-on-life relationships.
Okay, so I'm thinking obedience-based discipleship, especially when there is an assumption that there is an internal change, right? Like the Lord has worked on your heart, and the result of that internal transformation has led to an external action. How do you, in your context or with your leaders, how do you help prevent a tend or a bent towards moralism, where the obedience steps aren't just being boxes to check so we can move on to that next thing and say we're doing it? Yeah,
I think through relationships, through real deep relationships with the people that you're discipling. If it was a program, they could just turn up and tick the box and move on. But I think if you're in real relationships, and I mean, deep, multiple contacts throughout the week kind of relationships with the people that you're discipling, then it's really hard to just make it an absent from the rest of your body box ticked, because it shows.
You can only fool so many people for so long.
Yeah. That's right. You might be able to fool someone for a couple of hours a week or a fortnight at a discipleship group. But if you're touching base 5 or 6 times over that fortnight, in different formats, in different contexts, like you can see it. I mean, our culture, and particularly my generation, we're good at sniffing out the kind of lack of authenticity or frauds. And I am known and are probably unapologetic about going after that where I see that, because I actually I want people to have such a love for Jesus and such a heart that all of this stuff we're talking about is kind of comes and overflows from that. And often when we start to see that hint of I'm just doing the things I should be doing, it's actually because there's something going on personally with them and Jesus where there's a disconnect or there's something they're struggling through. And I'll unapologetically kind of dig in and go for that, to the point that some of my leaders were like, "Oh, you're not going there today?" I'm like, "Well, I might."
Oh, are you worried? Because I am now.
Yeah, because I want them to be in love with Jesus. Like, for me, that is the most important thing. If they are in love with Jesus, all of this will just flow. We talk with a lot of people who want to plant microchurches and missional communities, and they start with the idea that they want to plant something rather than they're so in love with Jesus that they're just reaching out and loving their neighborhood, and then the kind of church and disciples arise from that action. Yeah. Like, it just happens. That's what I want to cultivate in people, rather than that, I don't know, desire to plant or build or just do things for the sake of it. So one of my hearts and passions is around that real spiritual formation area, the kind of missional spirituality stuff, because I really think that there is a massive connect there that we've sometimes disconnected. Like, everything that we do in mission should be an overflow of what God's leading us towards and just shaping in us.
Yeah, an overflow of us being so in Him that it just comes out. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you encounter some leaders who have that build and mentality, and they show up, what are some of the first things that you do to help encourage them or help drive them into that passionate, life-changing love of Jesus?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big one for old school spiritual practices. So I take leaders on retreat days. I teach a lot of innovative kind of doer leaders stuff around silence and solitude, because for me, innovation is responding to the invitation of God to do something in His kingdom in a new way. So innovation doesn't come from who we are; it comes from who God is and His invitation to us. So if we're not listening and able to hear what He's inviting us into, then we're not going to step into those spaces of creativity and innovation in His kingdom. So for me, the most important thing for a leader is that they have a high awareness of God, and this is part of my thesis research, that they're actually able to be aware of what God's doing in and around them and how He's asking them to participate in what He's already doing. Because once they've got that, the rest is just skills that can be taught.
Yeah, wow. I love that. Wow. Okay. So many thoughts going through the head at the moment. You've been involved in seminary for a number of years. You've done your master's. You're working on your doctorate. Talk to us a little bit about the place of theological education in preparing disciples.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's changing. It's a place of challenge in Australia, because I don't know if theological education is really caught up to what God is doing in our world at the moment. I think it's really important. Like, I'm a big proponent of having deep theological education, being able to do good theological reflection. I think one of the key things we've got to be, if we're going to be missionaries, is we've got to be able to reflect theologically on our context, on all sorts of things in that sort of space. And there's skills that I don't think we learn generally in other ways. I'm a big proponent of theological education, but I think some of our methodologies might be challenged and might need to be challenged over the next season. So part of my doctorate is looking at how do we develop innovative missional leaders for the Australian context. And part of what I'm hoping will come out of that is actually some new thinking that might help and reshape the way that we go about theological education, particularly for these sort of apostolic pioneer leaders who otherwise tend to struggle to find a place in a standard seminary process.
So what are you finding there? What are your preliminary recommendations or the insights into theological education?
Don't spoil your change,
change.
but please tell us all the end of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I've looked at, I've done the spiritual assessment inventory, I've done some personality stuff, and then I've done life mapping interviews with 10 of the most innovative missional leaders that I could find in the Australian context, really to, I guess, deconstruct how God has formed them in the way that might help us understand, well, how does God form others? And the truth is formation is lifelong, and key moments of formation start from people's family of origin. So many of the innovative leaders that I'm looking at had parents who were entrepreneurial or innovative in some way, whether that was inside the church or outside the church. So many of them had a what I'd call a church of origin, so their first major church they were part of that had that kind of missional or innovative edge. It's certainly a part of gifting and that sort of space. So in a lot of these leaders, they pretty much come up mostly AP, so high apostle, high prophet across both. Probably because they're more innovative leaders than your standard church planters, the prophetic edge is a bit higher in some of these leaders. But there's a mixture of gifting, there's a mixture of calling, there's a mixture of personality. All of these sort of factors, family of origin, church of origin, all have a role to play in formation, as does theological education. And for people that falls at different places, but basically the key idea is really that theological education needs to do more work to help people in spiritual formation, so the ability to increase their awareness of God, their understanding of God, to help them deal with disappointment of God. So one of the things that we noticed in these leaders is using something called their spiritual assessment inventory. They have a really high awareness of God, so they are really good at knowing what God's up to or getting a sense of what God's calling them into and stepping into that. And they also have a really let me reverse it. They have really low disappointment of God. So when something happens that they're disappointed in or something doesn't go the way they think, they don't blame God for it because they could see, I guess they have a healthy, well-grounded relationship with Jesus that really holds them. And it also, that well-grounded relationship with Jesus is what enables them to step out and to take risks and to try new things and not let that knock them down. So these are leaders that I've interviewed who have been ministering for, well, they range in age, but at least 10 years, some of them as much as 30 years. And the thing that keeps them there is this really well-grounded, deep, mature relationship with God, even in the younger ones that I messaged. And I think most of them said that theological education didn't play a lot of a role in that. And I think it could. Like, I think we could be far more intentional with the spiritual formation that goes alongside the theological information to actually bring that kind of connection back together in that space.
And where do you see that intersection? What would we be looking at, do you think, in terms of how it looks, what the content is?
Yeah. Well, I think even small things like having people in intentional cohorts where they're actually doing life together, where there is a sense of coaching and discipleship that's being invested into that apart from the teaching and the theological information. Or even better if it was the same people who were doing both and actually integrating those two.
Right.
But certainly having, I mean, one of my dreams is how amazing would it be if everybody who was going through theological education had a spiritual director or had a coach or someone who is intentionally discipling them, not just for what's going on in their life and ministry outside of their theological education, but actually doing so to intentionally help them to take what they're learning academically and embed it in their personal lives. And I think that can be done in a one-to-one, that can be done in the same sort of peer group thing that I lead at the moment in discipleship groups, but something in those sort of cohorts, journeying together. I don't know what seminaries are like in the States, but in Australia, there's a lot of part-time students. There's a lot of off-campus people that the ability to have a cohort is probably really slim. at the moment, because people are coming at it from very different ways in very different places, and they're basically tapping in, getting the information, completing the assignments, and then tapping out. I think there's, not that I'd want to go back to the old live-in seminary where you had to go live on campus for 3 years, but I think there were some formation elements that we've lost now that that's not the typical process for people as they step into seminary. So how do we put in those formation elements in a way that is not restrictive of location and other things like that? And I think you can do that through even just online cohorts and that sort of intentional space being made.
You were highlighting, and you have highlighted, right? Like if we would hit reverse on the podcast, I think we will probably hear you say an increased amount of relationship or life on life. It's been hit quite a few times. So it's no surprise then, what does it look like to actually have some of that higher relational friction in a healthy way? That is going to be the thing that helps us grow in a spiritual capacity. In that spiritual leadership has to be done through a relational context. However, when we all, ourselves included, have created opportunity for us to spread out on an international basis the type of education, then we're substituting one good thing, but we're taking something off the table as well, which is that ability to be. Because if I was in a cohort with you right now, that would not be life on life. Australia or Melbourne and Houston are not next door. We are not going to run into each other at the supermarket. There is not really going to be an opportunity for our families to hang out. It's going to be a very scheduled thing. And like you said, certainly you can fool somebody for a few meetings here and there, but that person to person interaction in a cohort within a community has such a high value. That has such a high value. And if we were able to figure out, I guess, learn from the benefits of the past. Hey, there were these good things that happened when the seminaries were in a locale and everybody lived together and on the campus, that is, and they had opportunities to interact. And we were able to take aspects of that as well as this high relational, somebody really paying attention to your life. What could we do? What could we do if we were able to make some of those changes?
Yeah.
I think I don't know.
Well, yeah, and look, I think physical locatedness near each other is hard to beat. But I recently ran a cohort for women in church planting, and they're from all over Australia, so there's no crossover. But we met every week for 2 hours and talked intentionally using the Beatitudes and a course by Danielle Strickland called The Creative Way Down about our own walk with Jesus, our own kind of life and discipleship. And there was like 8 or 9 women in this cohort online that we ran, and I would consider them all now dear friends. And we had some incredible, deep sharing in that space. And so I think it's possible to do it in the online space, but it's got to be content that drives you deeper, and it's got to be people in the room who are committed to actually go and engage in that process. And for some of the people in our seminaries, that's going to be part of the challenge, is actually, are they willing and they open to engage in that depth of discipleship? We find in Australia there are some that kind of come along and say, oh, we'd like to plant microchurch, and we start talking about discipleship. And that actually they're not interested in. Or even some who will turn up to a microchurch because it's the cool new thing that's going on around Australia. But then they realize that in a microchurch there's no place to hide. Like, people can see your discipleship journey. You can't sit in the back row and have no one notice. And that's really threatening to a lot of people.
Right.
That's kind of deep. Actually, you want to get to know me and how I'm going with Jesus. I'm not so sure about that. Like, that's a real challenge, I think, in just Western culture generally.
I think what is so fascinating, listening to how you were talking about this further up and further in with Jesus, right? Driving into him and knowing him and being changed by him and how we think, feel, and act like Jesus. It really is built on the fact that disciples prepare. Like this, we have to actually put time and effort and heart behind it. We are not going to slip, trip, and fall our way into Christ-likeness. It's
it
not
has to
going
be
to
an
an
intentional
accident.
process.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I think a lot of our churches, even some of our micro churches, are not intentional about their processes of disciple making. They're intentional about going out on mission. They're intentional about what their gatherings look like, but they don't actually have an intentional process or way that they're thinking through how they're making disciples in that community. I think that's one of the really key things that differentiates the communities that we see that are the seeing disciples make disciples and those that are not, is actually what's their level of intentionality about this? How are they going after it? And what relational spaces, environments have they set up to make this a part of their intentional process together as a community?
And that's really key, isn't it? The relational part. I wonder how challenged we are because to be in relationships is somewhat organic, isn't it? I mean, you don't go into relationships with a list of things that you want to do every time you meet together. It's kind of, you're there with each other. You're listening, learning, loving in community. And there's a very organic element to those relationships that kind of rub against the systems that we create that are more structured and so on, that we ultimately feel more comfortable with for whatever reason.
Yeah.
I know
and
the
there's
reason.
so many times. Okay.
Well, the reason is
so,
because it's uncomfortable, right? Like the systems that we have set up have allowed us to disappear, to show up when we want to show up, and to bounce when we don't want to. And I don't know if anybody would actually say that, right? Like, oh no, I like showing up here because I have no accountability. That's why I show up. Nobody would say that. But I think undergirding that might be true. That might be true. Bree, I cut you off. What were you thinking when Michael proclaimed that?
I was just saying that so many times in our discipleship spaces and the environments that we set up, we might be saying, hey, we're going to get on about some content tonight, and somebody shows up and we say what God's been saying to all of us, and we're like, nope, we're not. We're going to actually talk about this and what's going on in your life, because we can't go on and talk about actually, identifying people of peace or whatever it might be that we're looking at, because you're having a really tough time and actually 2 or 3 other people in the group are having a similar struggle, and that's where Jesus is at the moment. So we actually need to stop and be, and that means that, whatever systems, or we don't really have systems, but, whatever ideals we had about that space need to go, because discipleship at that moment means responding to actually what Jesus is calling them to in that space, which annoys some of the people in our groups who'd love to get on and get everything finished.
Don't look at me like that. Okay, Bree, I have one final question, unless Michael one-ups me with another final question. You have highlighted the necessity of having an intentional plan. If there are people who are listening to this podcast and they've been toying with the idea of a greater intentionality, and they've taken your word, what advice do you have to them as they are now going to get pushback from the people who see this intentional plan and say, hey, can't we go back to the way where we just kind of where we're just kind of floating along and talking about Jesus, and isn't that enough? What advice do you have for them?
Start small and start with the people that are interested and on board. If you've only got 1 or 2 people, 3 people maybe that you can, that actually want to do this journey, want to go deep, want to take life on life discipleship, start there and invest deeply with them. Because what I've seen over the years is, as people have grown as disciples and they've started to really see some fruit and some life change, then some of the others around the edges who, let's be honest, they're watching, especially if you're in a church community and you see some growth and a couple of people really starting to not only step up into things that they're doing, but into that sense of just the sureness of their own faith and their confidence in God's faithfulness. And you see that change in people. And I think there's a lot of people longing for that change, but not necessarily wanting to do the work. So start with those who want to do the work, who want to do the journey, who want to do life on life, and just invest deeply. Like we talk about investing with your 3. So who are the 3 people that you sense God's calling you to invest in, disciple? Some of those might be people who are not yet believers. Some of them might be those who are people of faith, but just invest deeply with those 3. I mean, Jesus spent 3 years with 12 people predominantly. So don't go too wide. Don't try and preach it from the front and get everybody on board. Take 2 or 3, take 5 or 6 if you've got them, and just pour your life into those people and see what happens. Because if they then do the same, then you've suddenly 5 or 6 people then go disciple 5 or 6 other people, then very quickly you're discipling 30 or 40 people. But you're doing it well and you're doing it deeply. So start small and just, be unapologetic about going deep together.
I love that. And what would the time frame, obviously I just talked about loving that checklist, right? We have these things that we got to cover. But if somebody is going to get into this and they are going to want to pour their life into 3 other, 1 other, 2 other, 3 others, what might be a good expectation before you kind of say, okay, now let's start thinking about taking on some others? You all, like, generally, again, I understand this is almost an impossible thing to measure.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, it depends, right? If I'm discipling someone for 6 months, my hope would be that they're starting to read the Bible with someone else in that 6 months, someone who's not a believer, or, some basics, first steps. But in terms of, our discipleship groups, if I'm leading a group like that, I would expect that it would be at least a year before anyone in that group led someone else, probably 2, to be totally honest. So investing with people for at least a couple of years before they've got enough of the DNA and the understanding. I find that people do 1 year with you and they get an understanding of the space and the process and they think they can run with it. But the second year is actually where you see a lot more, I think, depth of growth beyond seeing the structure and the process that we use to getting the heart behind it and really picking up the DNA that is really driving this life-on-life discipleship. So, for them to actually be doing exactly what I would be doing, I would say at least 2 years. Yeah, so, which is slow.
And this is the beauty of it, right? Like, you hear the front end and it was like, hey, if you get 1 person and then the 2 of you spread and then it's now 2 more people and then it's 2 more people and you see the exponential growth and you get really excited about it. But then you've got Bree over here with the big thing of cold water and she throws that bucket on and said, also, it's going to be 2 years before that first replication occurs. And but here's the reality. There's a reason I asked you, because there is both excitement and realistic expectations. They need to be combined, right? So maybe we should say disciples prepare, but disciples are patient. And that's going to also have to be. I have a 12th characteristic, Michael, for version 2.0 when you write it later. Like, we have to be patient in what God's doing.
Yeah, and there's a balance, isn't there? I mean, the Lord could be working on people in unique ways that we're just not aware of, and He might have somebody in mind to do something, and we just need to be aware of what the Lord is doing and how He might use us to help someone else along. And that might be 2 years from now. It might be 2 months from now.
Yeah, and you don't disciple people in a vacuum, right? Yeah. So some people have a lot of this DNA already, or they're a certain way with their relationship with Jesus. Some people you can release really quickly into this sort of space because of what God has already been doing in their life before they ever met me. And even people who have just come new to faith who are starting to do this, they can start discipling others, but discipling them kind of where they've been. So, they're up to this point in really starting to go deep with Jesus. They can still be starting to read the Bible and disciple others. And that would be part of my expectation, is that they were doing some of that process with others. So it's not like they do nothing for 2 years and then you release them. It's throughout that process, they should be starting to do the things that you've been teaching them to do in their context as you go.
My goodness, I am so excited. Bree, thank you for being on our podcast. I think I'm going to be racing off from here, just with my brain on fire and the different ways and the people that I can be more intentional with and pouring into them. If other people who have listened to this podcast are just as excited as I have been, where can they follow up with you? Where can they connect with the work that God is doing in and through you?
Yeah, so micromovements.com.au is the main website you can contact me through, or I've got a Bree Mills one as well. But either of those spaces and you'll find me, and feel free to reach out and connect.
Okay.
Micromovements.com?
.au.
You gotta think like an Aussie, Michael. You gotta
think like an Aussie, indeed.
Well, Bree, thank you very much for joining us. It has been a blessing. And we also want to make sure to thank you, the listener, for dedicating your time to joining us on our Make Disciples podcast series. If this was the first podcast in the series that you've jumped into, please check out the ones that came before it. And also check out the rest of our catalog from the Ephesiology Podcast. You can just scroll back and find it there on your podcast feed. Lastly, I do want to encourage you, go over to masterclasses.ephesiology.com to check out the other resources that we have available to you there. I am sure it'll be a benefit and a blessing to you. So, for Michael, Bree, and myself, thanks for doing theology in community with us today on the Ephesiology Podcast.